When every list of great films, of course, many of them lead with Citizen Kane and say it's the finest film made. Do you agree?
No, certainly not.
Citizen Kane, the greatest film ever made according to so many critics and filmmakers alike. A revolution for its time, the first modern movie. It's so legendary that for a while, whenever something was seen as boundary-breaking and masterful, there were sure to be comparisons to this classic film, this motion picture landmark, a film that feels as relevant or more relevant now as it did back in 1941. A timeless classic by all accounts. But we only see the finished product, 119 minutes of a polished film. When we look deeper, we can see a chaotic shoot, ingenious innovations, vicious studio politics, deception, lawsuits, blackmail, and more. This singular film angered one of the most powerful men in the nation and almost brought down all of Hollywood.
So let's take a look, shall we? But before I begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. After all, it doesn't cost a dime.
Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the revered and reviled director and star of Citizen Kane, Orson Welles. He was born in the now infamous Kenosha, Wisconsin in 1915. He was mostly raised by his mother, Beatrice, as his father, Richard, was an alcoholic playboy who separated from Beatrice early in Orson's life. Most accounts label Richard as an inventor, a term Orson rejects, claiming his dad was a terrible inventor and kept the label because it sounded better than playboy. Welles made his name in the theater, starting in Dublin but settling down in New York City. As a part of the New Deal, FDR created the Federal Theater Project, which was a major stimulus to the performing arts, and it funded Welles's theatrical career in the 30s, although often he reinvested his own paychecks into his projects. Welles found success and fame in the theater with his play Voodoo Macbeth, an all-black rendition of the famous Shakespeare play, garnering a nationwide tour and critical acclaim. After much success in theater, Welles established his own in 1937, the Mercury Theater. It was a repertory company in which Welles cultivated an ensemble of actors that he may have initially cast in his plays, but within a couple years, he would cast many of them in his films. Indeed, most of the cast of Citizen Kane were actors from the Mercury Theater. At the same time, Welles worked in radio. Often, he was so busy with his theatrical work that he would have no time to go over his lines before recording. Famously, he voiced a character of The Shadow on the hit radio serial of the same name.
Professor, have you ever heard of The Shadow?
The Shadow?
Yes. You seem to have heard of me.
Eventually, he began writing and producing his own radio shows, adapting works like Macbeth and Les Miserables. He also brought his Mercury Theater to the radio, creating a series called The Mercury Theater on the Air. It was on this show that he broadcasted his famous adaptation of The War of the Worlds, creating a nationwide panic.
At least 40 people, including 6 state troopers, lie dead in a field east of the village of Grover's Mill, their bodies burned and distorted beyond all possible recognition.
I am terribly shocked by the effect it's had. I do not believe that the method is original with me or peculiar to the Mercury Theater's presentation.
So needless to say, by the time Welles went off to Hollywood, he was a sensation. He was the most famous prodigy in the United States, having seen more success in theater and radio by the age of 25 than most people saw in their entire lives, setting the stage for one of the most unprecedented contracts in Hollywood at the time. A contract with RKO that gave him creative control over his first 2 motion pictures, the first of which was, of course, Citizen Kane.
Enter Herman J. Mankiewicz, critic, playwright, alcoholic, gambler, and subject of David Fincher's newest film, Mank. In September 1939, something happened that would change the world of film forever. Herman J. Mankiewicz, while riding to New York, suffered a terrible car accident, breaking his leg and debilitating him. During his recovery, Welles hired Mank to write for his Mercury Theater radio show, but their professional relationship grew, and they decided to write a film loosely about media magnate William Randolph Hearst.
Now here's where the controversy begins. Mank claims that he wrote the script completely, that Welles had nothing to do with the screenwriting process. Now Welles claims that he wrote his own draft of the script, and that he combined the 2 drafts together to create the shooting script. Now for some reason this is still controversial to this day. So, let's take a closer look. Mank and Welles were separated while writing Citizen Kane. Mank was with John Houseman at a ranch in Victorville, California. Wells was at his home in Hollywood. Their communication was limited to telephones and telegraphs, which probably led to a bit of miscommunication. Adding to that, Mank signed a contract relinquishing his right to a credit on the film. You see, Mank was hired not as a writer, but as a script doctor, and there is a big distinction between the two of those. A writer is hired to write a screenplay, but a script doctor takes an already finished screenplay and punches it up or polishes it. Obviously, Mank did more than just polish the script to Citizen Kane, so he acted more like a writer than a script doctor. Justifiably, he wanted a credit, and after some arguing with Wells, he got his rightfully deserved credit on the film.
The controversy reached the public when Pauline Kael, a critic for The New Yorker, released her essay, Raising Kane, vindicating Mank and vilifying Wells. This essay is most likely a large inspiration for Jack Fincher's draft of Mank. In response, Wells' biographer and director Peter Bogdanovich released a rebuttal entitled The Kane Mutiny, defending Wells and attacking Kael.
But who was right? It doesn't seem that complicated, does it? But I think that there's a little bit more to it than meets the eye. Wells, for all of his fame and talent, wasn't as well liked as you might think. His friends noted that he had a way of alienating people with power and money, people who could fund his movies or tarnish his reputation. People also thought that he was narcissistic because he starred in his own works. Whatever the reasons might be, I think that there were a lot of people in Hollywood especially who disliked Wells enough to want to believe Mank's version of the story.
However, the truth of it all likely lives somewhere in the middle. Robert L. Carringer analyzed the screenplay drafts of Citizen Kane, finding that Mank wrote most of the scenes that dealt with the more historical facts of Hearst's life, but that Wells' contribution was not only substantial, but definitive. In truth, this makes a lot of sense. Mank seemed to want to just make a script about Hearst, but Wells has always stated that he saw the character of Kane as being an amalgamation of a lot of different people he knew or knew of. But the script was now done, and so now the film was ready to shoot.
On June 29, 1940, production for Citizen Kane began. Or did it? Well, technically no, but actually yes. You see, even though the studio gave Wells full creative control, I don't think he was betting on it. Plus, he just wanted to get a head start on making the film. So for the first month, the studio thought he was just doing test shoots. That's what he told them, and that's what they believed. Studio heads, journalists, and generally nosy people aren't that interested in camera tests. So Wells was able to make a big chunk of his movie free from prying eyes.
For these secret shoots, the cast and crew shot in various sets around the studios that were intended for other films. The famous projection room scene was shot in a real studio projection room for a budget of $809, the equivalent of about $15,000 in 2020. Working initially in the shadows was probably the best idea for Wells, a first-time director with a lot of pressure on him from both the studio and the public. He might have been experienced in theater and radio, but in film, he was extremely green. One anecdote that Wells loved to share was how he was so used to adjusting lights in the theater, so he just assumed that directors adjusted the lights on films. So for the first 10 days of shooting, Wells adjusted all the lights on set, while the lighting crew followed right behind him to undo his work. It was only after the first 10 days that he discovered that it was not his job to work with the lights, which absolutely embarrassed him.
And then somebody told me, and then I went and got on my knees and apologized and everything. I thought that's what the directors did.
But it was Wells' greenness that attracted cinematographer Greg Toland. Toland wanted to work with Wells because Wells wasn't restricted by what he knew. The fact that he knew next to nothing about how to make a film meant that his approach and his style would be more cutting edge, more experimental. He would push Toland to get shots that no other director would ask for because he would only think about what he wanted to do, rather than think about what he couldn't do.
Toland famously told Wells that he could learn everything there was to know about filmmaking in about a day and a half. According to him, people in film love to act like there's some great mystery to what they do, just so that they can gatekeep their positions. In addition to Toland's crash course on cinematography, Wells learned how to make films by watching John Ford's classic western Stagecoach 40 times.
He would sit in a projection room with people who worked on the film and ask them how they achieved each shot and why they shot things the way they did. So in essence, that was his version of film school. He learned how to make movies by seeing how another film was made. That's basically what we do here on the Kino Corner. One of his major takeaways from learning from the school of John Ford was to never shoot master shots. Ford never shot them, so why should Welles? But that's not even scratching the surface of Welles' eccentric approach to filmmaking. Welles loved showing Kane with low-angle shots, sometimes wanting the shots to be so low that they would have to cut holes in the studio floor. His low-angle shots also necessitated the inclusion of ceilings. Most sets then just had walls, so that cinematographers could stage their lights directly above the scenes. Not Welles though. He needed ceilings, so ceilings he did get. Although the ceilings in the film were made out of muslin fabric. Welles also loved incorporating technically challenging camera moves, moving the camera through furniture and pieces of the set. So art director Perry Ferguson had to design the sets so that parts of the set could be folded or moved. Ferguson also designed all the statues in the film as well as Xanadu itself. Welles also favored unconventional angles, showing Kane reflected infinitely in mirrors, shooting reflections off a snow globe, or any number of shots that practically nobody in Hollywood was doing at the time. But when people think about the cinematography of Citizen Kane, they think about the deep focus of the images. Everyone remembers the scene in which Kane's parents are inside the cabin, while we see a young Charlie Kane playing in the snow clearly through the window. This might not seem that impressive to people unfamiliar with filmmaking, but there was a lot that went into achieving the deep focus on this movie.
The first thing that you should know about depth of field is how you can manipulate it with a lens. To put it simply, the higher the f or t stop, the deeper the focus. But this comes with the caveat that less light makes it to the film, as the aperture is more closed off. Most filmmakers love to shoot with an aperture of f2.8, which lets in a lot of light, but has a very shallow depth of field. Now, the shallow focus and the bokeh that comes with it does lend itself to a very cinematic feeling, I've got to admit. But Welles and Toland did not want that shallow look. Instead, they kept their lenses between f8 and f16, which kept more people and objects in detail at the cost of light. Now, film back then was getting better at picking up light, but it still wasn't that great. So they needed a ton of light and a bag of tricks.
One device that came in handy was an optical printer, a machine that allowed the crew to re-photograph scenes. That way they could shoot the scene more than once with different subjects in focus, and when combined, everything would be in focus. It was also used to hide transitions and cuts. The drawback of this was that the optical printer increased the graininess, causing Welles to try to mask the graininess with effects like falling snow. Sometimes though, they just rewound the film to double expose it. Let's look at the scene in which Kane breaks into Susan's room. The medicine bottle and glass are in focus in the foreground. Welles shot these in a close-up with an unlit black background behind them, rewound the film, lit the set, and then shot the scene. Moving away from camera tricks, I want to point out that the aging makeup used in this film still holds up to this day. The makeup was done by Maurice Siderman, an apprentice at the time, which caused him to not get proper credit because the head of the makeup department, Mel Burns, refused to share credit with an apprentice. His method of aging the actors was unique and radical, and it would take a whole video for me to explain it. So instead, I'll leave some links in the description if you want to read up more on the process. Applying the makeup took several hours, causing Welles to have to show up to set anywhere between 2 and 4 a.m., which resulted in Welles working 16 to 18 hours a day. The most impressive use of the makeup, in my view, was during the kitchen montage, which was shot on the first official day of filming. In the scene, Kane and his first wife Emily grow more and more distant physically to show how they grow farther and farther apart emotionally over the course of their marriage. Shot in a single day, Siderman aged the actors 12 years, or 2 years with each shot. The actors, as I said earlier in the video, were almost all from the Mercury Theater, and when Welles brought the theater actors to the screen, they also brought the theater with them. The actors all heavily rehearsed their scenes, which, funnily enough, was not a common practice at the time. They did so because that's normal for theater actors, but also it saved Welles both time and money. Principal photography wrapped on October 24th, 1940, a little less than 4 months after filming began, though the cast and crew would reconvene a few weeks later for reshoots and pickup shots. The final cost of the film ended up being $839,727, or, adjusted for inflation, about $15.5 million. And so, after months of post-production, the greatest film ever made, known internally as RKO 281, was finished. But one man with a vendetta against the film would do everything in his power to make sure that Citizen Kane never saw the light of day. William Randolph Hearst's power and fortune cannot be understated. He was a politician and a media mogul who owned Hearst Communications, which specialized in yellow sensationalist journalism, so you can thank him for the terrible news we have today. I can go on and on about how powerful he was, but really all I have to do is show you his house. Yep, he lived in a castle, aptly named Hearst Castle, right on the California coastline.
Citizen Kane had Hearst right in its crosshairs, and to add insult to injury, Welles's dad was friends with Hearst, so this time, it was personal.
Citizen Kane wowed critics in its initial press screenings, but you've got to understand, up until this point, the public did not know what Citizen Kane was about. Welles and company kept journalists in the dark during the shoot. So, with the great reviews of the film, came the realization that this film was attacking one of the most powerful men in the country, a man who, at that, employed these journalists, one of whom was Luella Parsons, a film columnist for Hearst. Since she wasn't invited to a screening of the rough cut of the film, she felt blindsided, embarrassed, and angry to discover that it was attacking her boss. From then on out, it was war.
Acting on Hearst's behalf, of course, she demanded a private screener of the film. She needed to see this movie, and she walked out of the film. So obviously it hit a nerve.
Right after that, she threatened to sue RKO if they released the movie. RKO rightly ignored her, so Hearst blacklisted RKO from his newspapers. But again, how long was that gonna last? Less than 2 weeks, apparently. But Hearst and Parsons had another trick up their sleeves, leveraging the rampant Hollywood degeneracy against Citizen Kane. They threatened to expose all of Hollywood if the movie released. And they went even further, exposing how studios employed immigrants in trying to make a scandal out of Welles's affair with a married woman. This all resulted in the Hollywood studio heads offering to buy Citizen Kane for $805,000 so that they could burn all the prints of the film, erasing it from history. But none of these tactics worked. Citizen Kane released as planned to moderate success. Some cinemas didn't show it out of fear of Hearst. And of course, Hearst papers didn't even mention the film. But despite everything going against it, it was still a relatively popular movie.
But that didn't stop the attacks. When touring the film, Welles was approached by a police officer who told him that there was a minor in his hotel room with 2 photographers at the ready. If he cared about his career or about not going to jail, he shouldn't return. Was Hearst behind this? Welles doesn't seem to think so. He thinks it was a social climber who was trying to get in good with Hearst. But even if Hearst wasn't behind it, there are allegations that Hearst convinced J. Edgar Hoover to open up an FBI investigation against Welles, an investigation that would last a decade. Nevertheless, the controversy from Kane haunted Welles for the rest of his life.
Citizen Kane serves as the pinnacle of cinema and the start of Welles's downfall in Hollywood. If you all are interested, I will follow up with a part 2, wherein I will discuss Welles's later problems with studios and his subsequent films, which rival Kane in both quality and timelessness. But all's well that ends well. In 2012, Citizen Kane screened at Hearst Castle as part of the San Luis Obispo Film Festival, and it wasn't as controversial as one might think. Hearst's family noted that there were striking differences between Hearst and Kane, leading credence to Welles's assertions that Kane was inspired by many people, not just one person. But Hearst already knew that. On the night of the premiere of Citizen Kane, Welles found himself sharing an elevator with Hearst. Welles asked Hearst if he would like to attend his picture's premiere. Hearst didn't respond. When the elevator doors opened and Hearst exited, Orson said, "Charles Foster Kane would have accepted."